Okay, so when you hear the phrase, the cloud, what pops into your head? Probably an invisible, wireless web of data just floating around us in the sky, right? But what if I told you that the whole idea of a wireless internet is kind of just an illusion? Like, where does all our data actually, physically live as it zips across the globe?
Well, get this. The staggering reality is that 99% of intercontinental data traffic doesn't move through the air. And it's not bouncing off satellites either. It literally flows right along the bottom of the ocean. We are talking about the daily movement of, on average, $3.9 trillion in financial transactions. Plus, classified diplomatic comms and the massive data sets powering the whole AI revolution. All of it is traveling through physical cables sitting right there on the seabed.
So welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a high-stakes, completely hidden global infrastructure. It's absolutely crucial to modern life, yet it's literally out of sight. We're going to unpack the vulnerabilities of the world's information superhighways and look at how the depths of our oceans have basically become this intense theater for global geopolitical competition.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The internet is underwater. 2. Vulnerabilities at the bottom. 3. The Subsea Cold War. 4. The Digital Silk Road. And finally, number 5, Allied defense and future cooperation.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1. The internet is underwater. And honestly, we really need to look at the sheer scale of this network.
Just to picture it, wrapping the globe right now are roughly 400 physical cables. Together, they span about 1.2 million kilometers. But you know what's really fascinating about this infrastructure? It's who actually owns it. You might think it's mostly governments, but it's actually heavily driven by private sector companies. In fact, major hyperscalers, think Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, they now own or lease around half of all this undersea bandwidth. And they need it, right? It's the only way to support their massive cloud computing and data center needs.
Which brings us to Section 2, Vulnerabilities at the bottom. Let's explore the threats to this massive network. So, you might be surprised to learn that damage to these submarine cables is actually super common. I mean, between 100 to 150 cables are severed every single year. Now, the vast majority of these incidents, totally unintentional. It's mostly just accidental snags from fishing equipment or maybe a ship dropping its anchor in the wrong spot, plus natural hazards like underwater earthquakes. But here's the catch. The intentional hazards, specifically state-sponsored gray zone sabotage, that is rapidly escalating into a major anxiety for governments worldwide.
To really grasp the real-world consequences here, let's look at the Matsu Islands in Taiwan. Back in 2023, the only 2 submarine cables supplying internet to the 14,000 residents there were severed. That plunged the entire island into digital isolation for 6 whole weeks. 6 weeks without internet. Taiwanese authorities reported that Chinese vessels were responsible. Now, while it's notoriously hard to definitively prove a deliberate attack down there, authorities pointed to a pretty incredible frequency of these disruptions. We're talking 27 times since 2018. They characterized this as a form of gray zone aggression. Those deniable attacks that fall just short of actual war.
So the really tricky part is distinguishing between routine accidents and intentional sabotage. Take a look at this. We can contrast common fishing hazards with some highly suspicious events, like what happened in the Baltic Sea in October 2023. A telecom cable connecting Sweden and Estonia sustained damage right alongside a gas pipeline. Swedish and Estonian officials investigated this as a case of external force or tampering. Their investigations actually zeroed in on a Russian-flagged ship and a Chinese-owned vessel that were operating in the area as the likely culprits. It really highlights just how exposed these shallow water routes can be. All right, let's move on to Section 3, the Subsea Cold War. This is where we look at the great power competition playing out miles beneath the waves. Okay, when we look at who actually builds the physical internet, it essentially boils down to just 4 companies. As of 2021, you've got the US company Subcom, the French firm Alcatel, and Japan's NEC. Collectively, they held a massive 87% market share. But here's the critical shift to pay attention to. China's HMN Tech, which actually used to be Huawei Marine Networks, held an 11% share, and they have recently become the fastest-growing subsea cable builder in the entire market over the past decade.
Now that shift in market share, it has sparked some serious security anxieties among US and EU policymakers. Intelligence officials have outlined fears involving the potential for state actors to just tap into these unencrypted data streams, or even use the cable-laying process to map the ocean floor for military reconnaissance. Plus, there's a major vulnerability during the repair process itself. For example, Western officials have noted that Chinese state-controlled repair companies, like SBSS, have occasionally just turned off their radio and satellite tracking data while operating near sensitive coastal areas in Asia. And as you can imagine, that raises some big concerns about espionage.
But listen, it's not just a US-China dynamic here. Russia actually poses a highly unique threat in this theater. See, because Russia is a continental power with terrestrial internet connectivity to Europe and Central Asia, they rely far less on subsea cables for their own economy, which unfortunately makes them much more willing to exploit vulnerabilities in other nations' networks. Russian naval assets, including the spy ship Yantar and specialized submarines like the Losharik, have regularly been observed loitering near vital Western communication routes. And they're equipped with submersibles that are fully capable of cutting or tapping into these critical lines.
Moving to Section 4, the Digital Silk Road. Let's unpack China's global ambitions.
Back in 2015, Beijing launched what they call the Digital Silk Road Initiative, and the reported goal is incredibly ambitious. They're aiming at capturing 60% of the global fiber-optic cable market, heavily targeting emerging economies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And because these Chinese firms often get robust state subsidies, they're able to undercut Western bids by a solid 20 to 30%. That makes them incredibly appealing to developing nations who are just trying to bridge the digital divide. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the dramatic economic shift in the Trans-Pacific region. From 2016 to 2020, 75% of cables entering service had at least one Chinese owner. But look at the projections for 2021 to 2025. That number plummets all the way down to zero, literally zero. And that wasn't an accident. It's the direct result of intense diplomatic pushback, security reviews, and strategic rerouting by US and allied governments and corporations.
A perfect little mini-narrative of this competition is the Simi 6 cable project. This was a massive planned connection stretching from Singapore all the way to France. Initially, China's HMN Tech submitted a heavily discounted bid for it. However, the United States stepped in, leveraged some extensive diplomacy, issued warnings about potential future sanctions, and even threw in some financial sweeteners, including $3.8 million in targeted U.S. training grants. Thanks to those coordinated efforts, the U.S. firm Subcom actually ousted HMN Tech and walked away with the $600 million contract.
Finally, let's head into Section 5, Allied Defense and Future Cooperation. This is how Western allies are actively working to secure the seabed. This coordinated pushback we're seeing involves a few very clear, actionable steps. First, regulatory bodies are actively denying licenses for cables that land in territories deemed security risks, like the recent U.S. blocks on direct connections to Hong Kong. Second, they're providing multilateral loans through development banks to fund trusted infrastructure. Third, there's a big push to streamline those incredibly complex domestic permitting processes that currently just bog down cable laying. And fourth, governments are stepping up to subsidize national repair fleets. The U.S. Department of Transportation, for instance, actually created the Cable Security Fleet. They offer a $10 million annual stipend just to ensure trusted U.S. flag ships are on standby for any emergency repairs. And they're coordinating all of this through what is essentially an alphabet soup of international alliances. You've got groups like the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, the Quad Partnership in the Indo-Pacific, the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and the Clean Network Initiative. All of these groups are collaborating, they're sharing technical assistance, aligning their regulatory frameworks, and jointly funding projects, all to build out a secure, diversified ring of digital connectivity around the globe.
We're also seeing regional bodies taking localized action. The European Union, for example, recently established an expert group specifically dedicated to the security and resilience of submarine cables. They're actively mapping out vulnerabilities, standardizing risk assessments, and actually conducting stress tests across member states. It's all about formalizing their digital defense mechanisms to ensure that, whether it's accidental or intentional, damage down there doesn't end up crippling the European economy.
But as we look at all this rapid physical decoupling, it really leaves us with a profound question. If the US, Europe, and their allies continue to untangle their physical networks from China and Russia for the sake of national security, will this ultimately fracture the global web we all rely on? Like, are we heading toward a divided splinter net, where the physical infrastructure of the ocean floor dictates entirely separate digital realities above the surface? It is definitely something we all need to consider as this subsea Cold War continues to unfold. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.